Welcome to the Fantasy Zone. Get ready.
Bad video games. Over the years, mockery and warnings to stay away have turned into laughter and appreciation. Much like how people actively seek out bad B-movies to ridicule and enjoy them ironically, a surprising amount of games have earned themselves cult followings because of how comically poor in quality they are. Though to be fair, some of these games may have a passion behind them that can be appreciated, not unlike The Room or Birdemic. There might even be some good bits of design buried in there, or some really imaginative ideas. While enjoying bad games ironically has only really become a thing in English-speaking territories over the last decade, Japanese players and critics have been in on the joke for quite a bit longer. In Japan, the term associated with these titles is kusoge, a compound word consisting of ge, which means game, and kuso, which means shit. It's not known for sure where the term was first used, but it's fairly agreed that Famitsu writer Jun Miura coined the term in 2002 when he was doing a retrospective review for the Famicom game Iki. Ever since then, an entire kuso bunka, or kuso culture, has been formed, celebrating not only atrocious titles, but also games that might not be terrible as a whole, but have really lousy qualities about them, whether it's the writing, difficulty, or having puzzles that have way too goddamn obtuse of a solution. However, while these games are meant to be enjoyed in an ironic way, that's the key word. They're still enjoyable because at the very least they're still playable. But there's said to be one game that goes well beyond the point of being unreasonably bad, that there's hardly any enjoyment to be found. A game that feels so unfinished, so rushed, it feels like it's barely being held together with toothpicks and bubblegum. A game that Japanese players have taken to calling the Densetsu no Kusoge, or the legendary shitty game. That title was Hoshi wo Miru Hito for the Famicom, made by an enigmatic developer simply known as Another and released from the Japanese publisher Hotbee. Its title directly translates to People Who Look at the Stars, but some refer to it in English as Stargazers. It gets the same general idea across while rolling off the tongue a lot better. When I first heard of Hoshi's status as the one bad game to rule them all, I was kind of puzzled. A simple, innocuous-looking early JRPG is one of the worst games ever made. There's not as many things moving around as once as in an action title, and everything's in a drop-down menu. How hard is it to get something like this to at least an acceptable level of quality? Well, if there's one thing that the game does right, it would be the setting. Even though the RPG as we know it was still an infant genre at this point, a kind of trend had still been established where almost all of them were swords and sorcery fantasy worlds, following in the footsteps of their ancestors Ultima and Wizardry. Or, if you want to go back even further, you could say this was a holdover from the tabletop RPG days, like Dungeons & Dragons. Hoshi wo Miru Hito forgoes this with a sci-fi setting that even has some cyberpunk undertones, which was completely unlike anything else back in the day. The only other game really comparable in this sense would be Phantasy Star, which actually dropped 2 months later. And for those that didn't have a Sega console, it'd be a lot longer before they got to see another sci-fi JRPG. In a dystopian future, a supercomputer known as Crew 3 has managed to enslave the human race with mind control, driving them into extinction. However, this mind control is ineffective against psychics, but Crew 3 is hunting all these psychics down with a team of bounty hunters known as the Death Psychics. Now, only 4 children remain as the last hope of humanity to take down the AI and free the rest of mankind from this tyrannical force. Honestly, this is a really cool setup, but it's not totally unique to Hoshi. Hotbee actually recycled the same general plot from an older RPG they'd released for Japanese computers titled Psychic City. I don't really take issue with them repackaging the plot like this though, since to its credit, Hoshi does go in a slightly different direction in regards to plot progression, albeit a slightly more ridiculous one. Japanese computers were also a bit more obscure of a platform, whereas the Famicom was a lot more accessible, known and owned by most of the general public. So most people didn't know about Psychic City, or at the very least they hadn't played it. And like I said before, a sci-fi cyberpunk JRPG was really a fresh idea for the time, so why not take another stab at it now that the RPG genre had really taken off and streamlined itself? Literally, all this goodwill goes to waste the second you hit the start button. Okay, so I just gave you the general idea of the plot and what your end goal is, but do you have any idea where you're supposed to start, and more importantly, where the hell you even are? You're just thrown right into the overworld with no leads, clues, or conveyance as to where you're supposed to go. I know this is a really early console RPG, but even the first Dragon Quest, which was evidently an inspiration, started you out in the throne room being given the rundown by the king. And I know it's a bit unfair to draw comparisons to a title that came out later, but the original Final Fantasy, which was in development at the same time as Hoshi, also starts you off on the overworld, but you're literally standing right in front of the first town. Your eyes are naturally drawn toward it, and you can infer that this is where you should start your journey. Well, believe it or not, you're actually standing in front of the first town in Hoshi as well. It's just invisible. Yeah, a town that's not even visible on the overworld. The NPCs try to justify this by saying they've made the town invisible to hide it from the computer and the Death Psychics, which is a neat idea, but that's not first town material. Also, look how the path funnels upwards to the north. Isn't your immediate instinct to head in that general direction, thinking it'll lead to something rather than directly to your left where the town is? So already, we're just starting off and the player is completely disoriented. And it doesn't get much better from there. Hoshi can best be described as a game where stuff just sorta happens to you without even being really aware of what's going on. When you finally enter that first town, for example, you might stop at the store to stock up on some equipment. Only if you buy the first weapon available to you, the ray gun, your attack is literally lowered. Yeah, a gun firing a shot of straight plasma hurts less than just hitting them. Why is there an item in the game you can buy that does less damage than your default attack? Why would you put that in there? Why is it in the game? You'll also begin to notice just how mind-numbingly slow your walking speed is. It takes an entire second just to crawl across 2 tiles, taking a goddamn eternity to get from one place to another. Obviously getting even worse later on when you get to the lengthy dungeons or start doing fetch quests. Even worse, you constantly have to trek across the landscape over and over again because when you exit a town, it drops you off in a place that doesn't even make any sense. Like when you leave the second town, it respawns you right where you started your adventure, right from the very first tile. That is heinous. And speaking of tiles, at this point you probably noticed just how hideously ugly Hoshi is. First off, just look at this palette. I know the NES didn't have a super expansive selection of colors to choose from, but this mixture of muddy greens and swampy browns makes for a thoroughly unpleasant game to look at. If it's trying to be bright and appealing like Dragon Quest, well, it certainly dropped the ball there. But if it's trying to make something dismal and desolate to match the tone of the story or the artwork you see on the cover, it doesn't manage that either because it's too colorful. It manages to fail on both ends. Also, the tiles individually stick out like a sore thumb. Obviously, every RPG back then used tiles, as movement was typically tile-based rather than sprite-based, but they don't blend together or give the impression it's making one congruent landscape. They're all bordered and look like a weird carpet pattern. Also, tiles that have something important on them, like key items for example, aren't marked. If you happen to pass over one that has an item to collect, it just gets added to your inventory without any sort of notification. You can literally find an important item that's required to progress in the game and not even know it. It's awesome. The music's probably the best part of the presentation in the sense that only some of it is bad as opposed to all of it. I actually like the title theme as it's pretty desolate and despairing, helping establish the tone for the game in its setting. Then there are other tracks that sound like a complete scrambled mess. Now, as you probably noticed by this point, all you have under your characters in terms of health is a single digit. Is it possible that this game is really that cruel? Well, yes, but not for the reason that you're thinking. You see, your health in Hoshi is only shown to you in the first digit of the total number. Like right now, you could be anywhere between 50 and 59. This also means that when you do drop down to a single digit, anywhere from 1 to 9, it reads as 0. Needless to say, this makes strategizing in battle kinda difficult because you can't properly read the situation and get an accurate gauge on how healthy your characters are, just a rough guesstimate. And unlike most RPGs that put your standard attack at the top of the submenu, for some reason your ESP moves, which are basically spells, take the top priority. It sounds like nitpicking at first, but it actually becomes a bit of a problem because you can't opt out once you've hit the ESP command. There's no back or return selection and you can't hit the B button either. You either gotta waste your mana if you have enough, or waste a turn if you don't have any mana to use, essentially giving the enemy a free hit on you. So you can't just mash the A button if you're grinding on low-level enemies. You have to carefully make your selection each and every single time, and of course there's no auto button like in latter-day RPGs. Obviously, this makes grinding absolute torture. If you're familiar with the RPG genre, then you're probably aware that most NES RPGs haven't aged super gracefully. In terms of design, they're still solid, but in order to artificially lengthen the games in spite of low cartridge space, the amount of grinding required to progress was jacked up to a mind-numbing degree by today's standards. Because of this, it's more recommended that one plays a port or remake of those games, or even use an easy patch. Well, unfortunately, Hoshi is just as grindy as any of those other games. In fact, it might actually be worse. Then, imagine not being able to hammer on the A button just to fly through it all. On top of that, even from the very beginning of the game, some of the enemies are stupidly strong and might be too much to handle. You start off at level 0, almost like a harsh practical joke, and your attacks will hardly do anything more than 1 damage. And on top of that, there's only one way to heal in the entire early game, which is this spot in the first town. So be prepared to keep coming back to it over and over and over again. And on top of that, enemies actually have the ability to flee. They do so constantly, and if they get away, you'll be denied any money or XP you would have gotten from killing them. Oh, but you still keep all the damage they inflicted to you, of course. And as if that wasn't cruel enough, despite the enemies having the ability to bail out whenever they want, you don't have the option to flee battles whatsoever. Only later on you'll finally learn an ESP move, Teleport, that allows you to escape. As you would imagine, Teleport takes mana in order to use, which is annoying enough as it is, but by the time you learn this skill, you probably have more than one party member, and casting the spell successfully only makes the user flee. The others are just left behind to continue the fight. The only way to teleport your entire party out is if the spell fails. So yes, grinding, or battling in general really, is complete hell. But the cherry on top of it all, a programming error that drives the game well past the point of unreasonable, is how saving works. First off, it's password-based. This isn't unusual, as it was kind of the standard back then. The original Famicom version of Dragon Quest used passwords as well, actually. But they're still pretty lengthy and might be a bit of a hassle. No, the real game-breaking flaw is how the game selectively keeps track of your levels. The game only saves your level progression in multiples of 4. Let's say, for example, you grind up to level 7 and decide that you're done. You get a password, turn the game off, come back later, and suddenly you're level 4 again. Meanwhile, if you were level 8, your progress would have been recorded just fine. This also means that if you save at level 3, you go back to level 0. So not only is the game ruthlessly, unjustifiably hard and grindy as all hell, but you can't even save your progress properly unless you reach a certain milestone for literally no reason whatsoever. This completely breaks the game. Even without this problem, it'd still be a tragically made title, sure, but this one unbelievable programming error tears away any last shred of fun that could be had, and really just compounds the cheap difficulty and any other issues it has going for it. How about enemies you can encounter extremely early that have a 100% chance of inflicting you with a status condition? How about stepping on certain tiles that give you a status condition without any sort of heads up or clue since they look no different from the rest of the terrain? Those are pretty bad things on their own, but now imagine potentially losing a bunch of levels if you game over and... Oh my god. And you know what? It's a shame because there are actually some cool ideas here. Like a lot of Ksoge titles, there's a heart that's beating somewhere underneath this whole mess but never gets a chance to fully show itself. There is clearly a passion here that was dashed during the development process. Like how about your characters physically aging as the game progresses? That's a great idea and helps you become a bit more endeared to them as you take part in what is, for them, a massive life-spanning journey. Again, this game predates the original Final Fantasy by a few months, and definitely predates the original Pokemon titles, making it one of the first RPGs where your characters undergo some sort of design change to help you feel the sense of progression with your party. Or how about the crafting system? Yeah, you can bring items back to one of the NPCs and combine them together to get something different. Maybe you make a really good healing item, or you can make a bomb to help you get through bits of terrain. Then again, I don't know why you'd want to use the bomb, since if you grind for long enough you get the jump ability which allows you to bypass terrain free of charge. Oh god, I forgot to talk about the field abilities. They're literally your only incentive to grind since you need some of them to progress, and believe it or not, there's no boss battles in Hoshi wo Miru Hito. I guess it's kind of a neat idea to roadblock the player and have a certain XP requirement in a different context, but boss battles are enjoyable and can test the player's strategies, their understanding of the mechanics. Once you have all the overworld skills you'll need, there's hardly any reason to ever get in a fight again. And these skills are so unintuitive too. The aforementioned jump ability, for example, is really unclear as to when and where you can jump. It feels like for every interesting design choice there is in Hoshi, there's about 10 that makes the game absolutely intolerable. Again, there was clearly a desire here to make something interesting, but there needed to be a lot more time to work out all the problems and test the game some more. Everything here, all the problems I've listed up until this point, are indicative of a game that was rushed beyond belief. Now, why was that? I think what's important to take note of is that Hop B was both a publisher and a developer. They'd made a few titles in-house before, like the aforementioned Psychic City, but for the most part they were a publisher first and foremost, known above all else for fishing games. Holy Christ, did they make a lot of fishing games. There's probably as many fishing games with Hop B's name on them than there are actual fish in the Pacific. Now to be fair, Hop B did publish or distribute some pretty good titles over the years, like Graffiti Kingdom or Thunder Force 3, but they had very little involvement with those titles. Hoshi wa Miru Hito, on the other hand, was contracted by them specifically since it was a reimagining of their own creation. Now, here's where things are going to get a little speculatory on my part, since the details surrounding Hoshi wa Miru Hito's development are a bit obscure. The original Dragon Quest was released on May 27, 1986. Hoshi wa Miru Hito dropped a mere 17 months later on October 27, 1987. I think what happened is that once Dragon Quest started to really pick up steam and become a smash hit, Hop B immediately turned their sights on catching lightning in a bottle and cashing in on the success with a title of their own in the same style. Now, 17 months isn't that bad of a development period, especially with how simplistic games were back then. Like I mentioned before, the original Final Fantasy dropped 2 months after Hoshi wa Miru Hito. So, what went wrong here? Well, here's where we get into Another, the mysterious developer behind the actual game itself. It's believed Another was really just one man making the whole game from the ground up, that man being Naoki Morishima. Again, the details are kind of obscure, and there's never been any flat-out concrete evidence to suggest this is ubiquitously true, but Morishima seems to be the only name really tied to any games developed by Another, such as the NES version of Hop B's flagship Black Bass series. On top of this, once Morishima was poached to work at a more respectable company, Toshiba Emi, the Another development team just kinda seemed to vanish into thin air. Could it be that they disbanded after losing their lead programmer, or was it really just one guy running the whole operation? If it is the latter, all of this would make a lot more sense and be pretty excusable, as even with more than a year, there's only so much you can expect from one guy making an RPG from scratch. Yes, even in the year of 1987, understaffing and crunch was still running rampant, believe it or not. I think all of this is worth mentioning because when Morishima would eventually go to work at Toshiba Emi and would be put in the producer or director's chair, he honestly did a pretty alright job. I wouldn't say any of the other games he worked on are masterpieces, but also not complete train wrecks like Hoshi is. But hey, it's hard to say who the finger should be pointed at since we still don't know 100% what went on behind the scenes. Morishima doesn't seem to be involved with game development anymore, and Hop B folded sometime after 2005. So with hardly any of the parties involved being in the game industry anymore, we may never know. With Hop B out of the picture, Hoshi wa Miru Hito, along with all of Hop B's properties, are now under the ownership of an independent Japanese company called City Connection, which was formed in 2005. They originally started off as just doing soundtracks for classic games by Jellicoe, hence the name, as well as SUNSOFT and Hop B under a label by the name of Clarice Disc. They actually did a soundtrack for Hoshi back in 2013, both in CD form and, hilariously, even managing to get it on Spotify. But when Jellicoe went under in 2014, City Connection bought up most of their properties and eventually Hop B's as well. And so, just at the end of last month, literally out of nowhere, we just got a Hoshi wa Miru Hito Switch port. And though they've never said it outright, it's pretty clear that this re-release was done specifically for the Kusoge crowd, almost like an 8-bit freak show. And it is the preferable way to play the game. A lot of the additions are, admittedly, rather unremarkable since it's playing catch-up with things that have been available in emulators and ROM hacks since 2008, like rewinding, save stating, increasing the movement speed on the overworld, and being able to start with a huge surplus of gold and XP all the way up to level 30. They did add some really nice borders, even taking fan art submissions from fans in order to do so. There are still a lot of big game design issues with Hoshi, and it would have been nice to adjust the XP and gold distribution rather than just cruising the game with a ton of levels right from the start. But it makes the game actually playable, so at the very least you'll be able to feasibly see it all the way through to the end, with both the good and the bad. Also, despite some early tweets in English suggesting there'd be a localization, which would mark the game's first official Western release, the game is, as of now, a Japanese eShop and Japanese language exclusive, which is kind of a bummer. I don't know, maybe there were plans, but they fell through. Either way, it's a shame since the English patch available for Hoshi is pretty unfinished and buggy, but I guess you could say unfinished and buggy is the underlying theme of Hoshi as a whole, so it's oddly appropriate. Still, for those that understand the language or are willing to use a guide, this Switch update is a treat for that hardcore cult audience. Said audience treasuring the game to an insane degree. In fact, predating the Switch version by about 11 years is a fan remake made in RPG Maker simply titled Stargazer. With much more crisp visuals, most of the awful design choices and errors from the original game scrapped, and some cool puzzles added, it's an insane labor of love made by fans for fans. They even re-added one of the multiple endings from the original Hoshi wa Miru Hito that was left in the game's code but never fully implemented, along with the boss battle that accompanied it. The remake does create a bit of a Theseus' ship-esque dilemma, where it's kinda hard to say if it's even the same game anymore now that everything about it's been given an overhaul, but it still has the same scenario and is a pretty tough RPG as well, so it still should count. The only real downside is that it's yet to be translated, which is a shame, but if you can understand what's going on, this might be something worth checking out, as it allows us to see the travesty that was the original Hoshi wa Miru Hito with fresh eyes, fixing all those disastrous issues and allowing us to appreciate more of what it was going for. As for the original Hoshi wa Miru Hito, while it is an amusing game to stand back and marvel at from a distance, actually playing it is about as enjoyable as a root canal. It is a thoroughly unpleasant game that I believe has truly earned its title. I usually don't go out of my way to play bad games since life's too short to even play all the good stuff, but out of every title I've encountered throughout my life, I do believe Hoshi wa Miru Hito is probably the shittiest of them all. Yes, I would say to a legendary degree.